Is it allowed to ask questions, Steve, or do you want us to be quiet? Or I don't know if there are any new rules in this kind of meetings.
You can ask questions.
Okay. You said identifying with the knowing. Now, of course, maybe it's just a matter of words, but identifying as a negative annotation, with identifying to the body mind. But I still wonder whether identifying is a good way of expressing it, because that seems to be an action or something. I mean, is it not just to see or to I don't know what it is. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it makes sense. It's like anything, there's a relative meaning and absolute meaning. So when you identify with the mind, a strange phenomenon occurs where you become a thought that thinks the mind. If you think you're the mind, the capacity of mind is to produce a thought, isn't it? So, so if you identify with the mind, you see yourself reflected in the mind, and you become the capacity of mind. You become identified, where you become identity, an I, a subject, a sense of subjectivity, tension in the mind. That gives the impression that one is thinking their thoughts. So in that sense, identifying has a negative connotation. It only has a relative meaning. It's only, consciousness identified with the mind develops a relative meaning where it becomes relative to the mind, where it becomes a thought that thinks the mind. Okay, so in that sense, you are quite correct in thinking that identification has become synonymous with separation or an inferred action, someone doing this. So I can understand why you would bring that into question, definitely. And that phenomena in itself is an interesting phenomena. Caught up in the relative idea to the mind, the I thought that is the thinker of the mind, whereby from a subjective point of view, that subjective idea of yourself gives the illusion that from that subjective point of view, you experience the mind. It's here where they say the ego is a thief. It comes in and claims experience. And it's precisely due to this form of identification, or this kind of identification. So when you identify with the mind, and because identifying with something is becoming the same as that, or seeing yourself in that. So as an I thought that claims experience of your mind, what happens then is that the mind, under siege from such a subjective identity, will give the illusion of thinking the mind, and thus the mind goes into a kind of avoidant activity. Of course, this avoidant activity is called avoidant because it's avoiding what's truly experiencing, which is your being, which is consciousness. So you get caught up in a pseudo experience, subjective experience, thinking your mind. And this activity we call seeking. This activity we call avoidance of what is truly experiencing as knowing. what the mind does when you take siege of the mind as a subjective idea, avoiding what's truly experiencing, the mind then possesses the body sensation. It begins to direct, misdirect the body sensation, because it feels it's experiencing the mind. It believes it's experiencing the body. And so thus the I thought claims the body mind in that sense, through identification, becoming subject to the mind, thus being a thinker of the mind. And it's the thinker of the mind that's actually the illusion. It's quite incredible how the subject illusion, attachment, that thinks the mind, through its seeking activity, through its avoidance of what is truly experiencing as consciousness, the subject idea, me, I, will blame the mind and not see itself. It sees the thought stream, the natural thought stream that occurs, as something that needs to be controlled, something that needs to be eradicated. It sees the mind as something that needs to come into abeyance, where there is no thinking, no thought. And in its association to its claim of the body, it will try and sort out, it will try and manage the bodily sensation also. It will claim experience. When one sees this activity, when one is aware of such a pull to think the mind, when one spots the I, this activity, one simply becomes aware. It's here you can inquire into awareness. It's here you can inquire. And see that what is aware of this process of separation, what is aware of this activity, this avoidant activity of consciousness being experienced. As awareness, one can see that one is actually transcendent of such experience, such activity. It can be seen that awareness in its observation, in its perfect witnessing, you can see that the activity being known, however transient, however up and down, however fleeting, however long, it does not, this activity does not qualify the witness, does not alter the witness, take anything from it or add to it. It is seen then that awareness or consciousness does not relate from the idea of you believing that it experiences you. It is here that the word transcendence comes in. The reason it's transcendent is because awareness in its witness position can see that via its own permanent nature does not actually relate from that thought, that subjective thought I, that gives the illusion to think yourself and to possess your body sensation. See? At this point of witnessing, awareness simply identifies with itself. And there's no inference coming from one's mental or emotional will. There's no consolation for your mental or personal will, or even your body sensation. It simply witnesses permanently, undifferentiatedly, from itself as the self. When consciousness identifies with itself, it does not separate from itself to infer meaning to the self. It simply remains the self. Awareness in its liberation or in its realization identifies with itself by simply being the self. It does not separate, it remains one. That's the absolute meaning of identification. Identifying with the mind creates a false identity, a false identification. But awareness in its awakening to its permanent witness is the absolute identification of the self, knowing that there is only the self. When you lose that meaning, you lose that meaning through identifying with the mind as a means to activity and perceptual experience. But what this I thought claims is only relative meaning, only acquired meaning. And whereas identified with the mind, it has become a thought that thinks the mind. This is distorted identity. This is the false self. This is the I activity, the false I. But this activity can be seen, can be witnessed. Then when the witness comes to see that it is transcendent, it is not located here, but instead it is knowing of here. It has transcended. That is the transcendent. And there's no inference from your mind, your body, your heart. It simply is the case. And it's just knowing. When this knowing is examined through contemplation, not through inference, but through knowing itself, you then come to see that knowing is unknowing. It has no acquired meaning. It doesn't take anything from the mind or the body to add to itself or to know itself even. Knowing thus identifies with knowing without separating, without reference, without inference. It is only when we identify with the mind that through this form of identity, we're divided into duality. Duality is seen as the duality of identity is seen as the subject I thought that continuously is caught up in the activity of the object thought that it thinks. This is desire. The I thought follows its own thinking. It follows its own thoughts, should I say. And all thoughts are subject to the thinker, to the I. But this can be seen because this, in fact, is a habit. This activity of subject-object relationship, the I thought that thinks the thoughts, is a habit, is an activity. It is only when what is examined in contemplation or meditation that awareness is seen as transcendent. Here, consciousness allows the attachment to this habit on 3 levels to go through dissolution. Awareness or knowing, identifying with itself as the self, as is, the absolute meaning. Sorry, I had a pop-up. I need to find where I was, sorry.
You were talking about the 3 levels, Steve?
Ah, thank you, thank you, thank you. So as awareness, absolute awareness, or purity of awareness, awareness without object, which is very different from the I thought, because the I thought needs object, needs thought, thinker of your thoughts, directs the bodily sensation, thus identifying with the mind, it possesses the body. This is full-on attachment. This is full-on. Full-on mental, emotional, physical identity, okay? So via the witness, through meditation, through contemplation, through just being, just observing, witnessing, you see this activity and you come to see that knowing is transcendent of such activity. And in its knowing of such activity, it can, in its identification with itself as the self, not identify with the mind, so to speak. But what you have to learn here, what you have to know here, is that while you're not identifying with that not, which is a tension that's made up of a suggestion to think your thoughts, it's a pull, it's a tension. That's why in Advaita it's called a knot, it's tight. And it's this remarkable suggestion that's always been a habit of you, to tighten and to think, to own your body, to possess your body, to think your mind, right? what draws you into this process of identification is this suggestion that you are the body, you are the mind. But as knowing, you can contemplate this tension, you can contemplate this suggestion that you are the mind, and not identify with it, but instead identify yourself as knowing, which basically means remaining as knowing. There's no other inferred meaning coming from outside. There is just be the knowing, okay? It's transcendent of this not. But as soon as you identify yourself as knowing, you then become the direct experience of the not. You're allowing attachment to the mind to be experienced by consciousness. You're allowing consciousness to be the experience. But here there'll be a fight between consciousness being the experience and this suggestion pulling you into being a thinker of your mind, you see. But if you identify yourself as knowing, you no longer feed this not. You no longer believe in it. You remain in the faith of what is. You remain in this purity of transcendence, witness. The knowing then, where it's no longer feeding this habit to identify this not, this tension, the tension not being fed begins to weaken. And it begins to go through what is commonly called dissolution. It's only this tension that goes through dissolution, only this suggestion that you identify with the mind and become a thinker of it. And so being transcendent of this activity, this habit, and this pull to separate, as knowing, you have to embrace that experience completely. You cannot infer any meaning other than as knowing being the experience of tension. What happens then is the tension begins to open up, it begins to dissipate because you're not feeding it. And if you're not feeding it, it starts to associate to what is experiencing. It is here that you understand the saying, there's a good dog and a bad dog. And when they're fighting, a person says, which dog will win? And someone says, it's always the dog that you feed will win. It is here that you see the two dogs. This tension to identify, this suggestion to identify, will be a dog, will be the bait for the dog. The mind in its habit will have you think it. And if you identify with that not, you feed it and you lose your knowing immediately. You lose the purity of knowing and you get caught up in attachment. You lose the witness and you become a thinker. And when you become a thinker, you think, I don't like this, I'm in it, I need to go back. What one has to do is completely accept the tension, which is counterintuitive when you're doing nothing. It's always felt more intuitive to deal with tension because that's kind of what the ego does. It just deals with all the tension. As the witness, completely accept the tension, completely, willingly. maintaining your integrity, maintaining identification with consciousness itself as the self or awareness. And it will not feed the tension, and the good dog will begin to win, because as you do not feed it, that dog, the tension, it begins to open up, and simultaneously the grip of the I, being the experience of your mind, goes through dissolution, and then the mind simultaneously begins to associate truly to what is witnessing, to what is seeing. This is the first attachment that goes through dissolution. This is the thinker that thinks you. It's the dog that you've fed all your life. It's the dog that's become strong, the dog that seems to win everything, do everything, dominate everything, but no longer feeding it. Knowing, identifying with itself as knowing, realizes itself that then there is no thinker. When the thinker goes through dissolution, the mind then opens up. When the mind opens up, associating to the witness, there's no thinking. There's nothing except for a sense of being here. Knowing, identifying itself as knowing, then becomes the predominant reality. In its predominance, in its ascendance, the mind comes inward to what is seeing, and what is seeing then, in its knowing of the mind then reflects a sense of here, and this reflecting of what is here being associated with what is knowing, the knowing is also here. It's like the emptiness then becomes the form, and the form is the emptiness.